April 5, 1986. West Berlin, under a table, wedged beside the DJ booth, a travel bag sits unnoticed. Inside it, plastic explosive, packed with nails and screws to maximize the wound count. In 4 seconds, a nightclub full of off-duty American soldiers becomes a crime scene. 3 people were killed and 230 were severely wounded. But how these terrorists penetrated into a club filled with US Army personnel, how they were even able to plant a bomb there. This is the story of how one bomb in one basement disco rewrote the rules of American military power, and how it took German investigators 15 years and the collapse of an entire country to find out who pulled the trigger.
This time, the target was a nightclub.
That support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities.
By the spring of 1986, Ronald Reagan and Muammar Gaddafi weren't just adversaries, they were personal enemies. By 1986, Gaddafi had spent over a decade building a reputation that earned him that title. At home, dissent was not tolerated, it was hunted. Gaddafi's regime ran what defectors and exiled Libyans called the Stray Dog Campaign, a program of assassinating Libyan opponents living abroad, in London, Rome, and beyond, sending hit squads to silence critics who thought distance meant safety. Domestically, public executions of dissidents were broadcast on state television as a warning to anyone who might follow their example. Abroad, Libya had become a hub for the era's terrorist networks. Gaddafi bankrolled and armed the Provisional IRA, supplying weapons and explosives that fueled years of violence in Northern Ireland. He funded and hosted training camps for militant factions of the PLO and other groups waging attacks across Europe and the Middle East. Western intelligence agencies connected Libya to the Abu Nidal organization, one of the most violent Palestinian militant factions of the decade. And just months before the Berlin bombing, Abu Nidal operatives had carried out coordinated machine gun and grenade attacks on the Rome and Vienna airports, killing 19 people at ticket counters crowded with holiday travelers. Libyan involvement in financing and supporting the attackers was widely suspected by American and European intelligence. To Washington, Gaddafi wasn't simply a hostile foreign leader, he was the financier and safe harbor for an entire ecosystem of terrorism, a one-man rogue state exporting violence while denying his fingerprints were on any of it. Reagan's administration had already labeled Libya a state sponsor of terrorism, frozen its assets, and expelled its diplomats. What was missing wasn't motive to confront Gaddafi. It was an attack direct enough and provable enough to justify open military action. Berlin would soon provide both. Reagan called him the mad dog of the Middle East. Gaddafi called America an imperialist aggressor. Weeks earlier, the two nations had traded fire in the Gulf of Sidra, US warplanes sinking Libyan patrol boats after Gaddafi drew his self-declared line of death across international waters. It was a proxy war without a declared front. That front found its way to West Berlin, specifically to a nightclub called Belle. Belle wasn't glamorous. It was a basement disco in the Schöneberg district. Cheap drinks, loud music, popular with West Berlin's working crowd, and crucially with the thousands of American soldiers stationed in the divided city. On any given night, half the room was in uniform, off the clock, dancing. That made it a target hiding in plain sight. At 1:45 a.m., the bomb detonated. The blast killed Sergeant Kenneth T. Ford of the US Army and Nerman Haney, a Turkish civilian, instantly. A third victim, another American sergeant, would die of his injuries 2 months later. 229 people were wounded, some losing limbs, some scarred for life. Within hours, Washington had a name in mind, proving it was another matter. The proof came not from Berlin, but from the sky. The National Security Agency had been intercepting communications between Tripoli and the Libyan People's Bureau, Libya's diplomatic outpost in East Berlin, for weeks. On March 25th, 10 days before the bombing, a cable went out from Tripoli ordering an attack designed for what the intercept literally called maximum and indiscriminate casualties. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of April 5th, barely 15 minutes after the blast, a second message. Confirmation. Success. For Reagan, this was the smoking gun he needed. Not a courtroom-ready case, a war-ready one. 10 days later, on April 14, 1986, the United States launched Operation El Dorado Canyon. F-11 Ren bombers, F-A-18s, A-6 intruders, dozens of aircraft targeting Libyan military infrastructure, intelligence sites, and deliberately, Gaddafi's own residential compound at Bab al-Azizia. But getting there was its own battle. France and Spain, unwilling to be associated with the strike, refused the US Air Force overflight rights, so the F-11 Ren flying out of British bases didn't take the direct route across France. They flew around it out over the Atlantic, down past Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, a 6,400-mile round trip. The longest fighter combat mission in history at that point, refueled again and again in midair over open ocean, in total radio silence. Here's the paradox that swallowed the investigation for the next 13 years. West German prosecutors knew who was likely responsible. The NSA intercepts all but named the operation, but those intercepts were classified at the highest level, sources and methods material the United States would not declassify, not even to help convict the people who planted the bomb. You cannot try someone in an open court on evidence no one is allowed to enter into the record. The case didn't collapse, it just froze, stuck in a kind of legal limbo, known but unprovable, for over a decade. Then, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Nobody connected to the Belle investigation was thinking about disco bombings when East Germany's government dissolved. But reunification did something the NSA never would. It opened the vault. East Germany's Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, had been watching everyone, including the Libyans operating out of East Berlin. And the Stasi, famously, wrote everything down. Surveillance logs, informant reports, movement records, a paper trail documenting, in exhaustive East German bureaucratic detail, the exact cell that organized the bombing, independent of anything the NSA had intercepted. For the first time, prosecutors had evidence they could actually use. The Stasi files gave the case names and faces. Musbah Eder, a Libyan operative working out of the East Berlin Bureau, was identified as a key organizer. Verena Chana, a German woman married into the network, was the one who physically carried the explosive-packed bag into Belle and left it under the table. The trial opened in Berlin in 1997 and ran for nearly 4 years, one of the longest criminal trials in German history. In November 2001, the court delivered its verdict, 4 defendants convicted, and significantly, the court formally found that the Libyan state itself had orchestrated the attack. What the court could not do was put the order directly in Gaddafi's hand. The evidence tied the operation to Libyan intelligence and the East Berlin Bureau. It could not, in open court, prove Gaddafi personally gave the command. 15 years, a fallen wall, and a 4-year trial had closed most of the gap between suspicion and proof. Not all of it. By then, Gaddafi had already begun a different kind of campaign, buying his way back into the world. In the early 2000s, Libya paid roughly $35 million to the non-American victims of the bombing, Germans, and Hanne's family among them. Then, in 2008, it went further, a $1.5 billion fund, financed jointly with the United States, to settle outstanding terrorism claims, Belle among them, alongside Lockerbie and others. In exchange, Washington restored Libya's legal immunity and, eventually, struck it from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Checkbook diplomacy. Closing a chapter, Gaddafi refused to formally confess to strip away the specifics, the disco, the intercepts, the Stasi files, and what's left is a template. El Dorado Canyon established something new in American strategy, that a president could order a major preemptive military strike on the strength of secret intelligence alone, intelligence the public and even the courts would never see. 15 years later, that same logic would scale up dramatically after September 11th, classified intelligence driving military action long before, and often instead of, a courtroom verdict.
Today, I authorize the Armed Forces of the United States to begin a limited military action in Libya. That action has now begun.
Which leaves the question this story never really answers. Military action needs speed. A strike ordered today is useless if it waits for tomorrow's evidence standard. But justice, real justice, the kind a democracy can stand behind, needs time. It needs disclosure. It needs proof that survives cross-examination, not just conviction. In West Berlin, that gap took 13 years and a collapsing wall to close. The next time, there may not be a Stasi archive waiting to fill it in.